Well, my 4-year-old would go for The Dinosaur Who Lost His Roar by Russell Hunter, which is read most nights in our house. It's a little treat to a big roar at the end.
Not a good dinosaur voice then.
Yeah, well, it usually falls to my 2-year-old who reads it with us, and she does the big roar at the end of the book. But it's great family involvement. Anyway, to Paris. It's today, the day that Team GB win their first gold medal of these Olympic Games. It could come in the equestrian or gymnastics later, or perhaps back in the pool where he couldn't come much closer last night. Adam Peaty denied by 2/100ths of a second in the final of the 100 metres breaststroke.
200 for a second and I could have got gold by. I was looking 0.01 and could have got bronze, and 0.0 whatever it was I could have got 4. And to get a silver, I feel like I've won. And I think this the what means the most. I love the sport. I love how much it's taken me. And the challenge, they're just still there. And these are happy tears.
Peaty having to settle for a share of the silver medal. Well, let's talk to the former GB swimmer Alice Deering, who joins us now on the programme. Morning, Alice.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You are an open water swimmer, I'm important to say, but went to the last Olympics in Tokyo alongside a lot of these swimmers in Team GB who are now in the pool in Paris, including Adam, of course. What did you make of that race last night?
That race was exciting, but scary at the same time. I can't believe it was only like before was swimming. Like it felt a bit aged, to be honest. But I think it also that we've been about the passion for what he's done for swimming, what he's done for sport in Britain and internationally. His achievements of 6 medals at the Olympics, no one can ever take that away from him. He's an incredible athlete, and to come back from what he's spoken about his struggles with his mindset and addiction and things like this, I think it's really, really powerful to see him back at the top of his game. The time is a little bit slower, and he wanted that gold medal for him, but still an incredible achievement.
Let's just briefly talk about your friend Matt Richards, competing in the 200 metres freestyle this evening. We're speaking to you after from Worcester Swimming Club, where Matt was first discovered aged 10, and he has a real chance of a medal tonight.
Yes, absolutely. Matt is an absolutely great guy. Fierce competitor, great ambassador for swimming and for TGB, and it's really exciting to see him do the individual this time round. Amazing, really. Took it, and now he's got this individual to deal with, and having to swim probably a little bit harder than he would have liked. So he would have been flushed out this morning, gone back, probably had a nap, get some food in, make sure he's rested and gets the pool nice and early to get a good warm up in and soak up the environment as much as possible to make sure he's relaxed as much as he can with the nerves. But he's a seasoned competitor, he'll be used to this. So I'm excited for what he can do.
See if all that breakfast stood in its later on this evening, as we say, Matt Richards off the 200 metres free at 7:40 UK time this evening. You can watch that on BBC One. Alice Deering, former GB swimmer, many thanks. And finally, Michelle, Justin, for all the joy of these Olympics, I'll leave you with the other side of the games when hopes of glory are dashed in an instant. GB boxers have not made a good start in Paris. 3 of the 6 strong team are already out of the opening round defeats. The latest was Rosie Eccles, whose Olympic dream is over after defeat in a women's 66 game.
I feel like I'm in a dream. Like, you know how much I pushed to get here? I'm so ready from everything, and now my dream's over, I feel like the cycling in my body was doing the cycle. So that's over for me. I just can't make sense that way, but it wasn't meant to be, for whatever reason. I can't get any more out yet, so it's really sad.
And as the boxer, Rosie Eccles reminds us all, I guess, for all the medals and memorable moments, there's another side to these Olympic Games. More highs and lows to follow today for sure.
Thanks very much. Now do something later this morning.
On BBC Radio 4, a comedic classicist.
From chaos comes earth, and then Erebos, night. And then night produces death and sleep and misery, all the goth gods, essentially.
Natalie Haynes presents ancient perspective.
In brief, women are an affliction, and this one is particularly an affliction because she's the first woman, and then there'll be more women, and women, small rant from Hesia, aren't as good as bees. Now, I would just like to make the point that it actually depends what you're grading on.
Natalie Haynes stands up for the classics. Monday mornings at 9:30 on BBC Sounds and Radio 4. To the weather, a little bit cloudy in the north, some light rain in the west, but mostly warm and sunny.
You're listening to Today on Radio 4, where Tom Sanders has a summary of the news.
The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is set to scrap or delay a series of infrastructure projects in order to fix a gap in the public finances. The Treasury says an audit shows the previous government overspent by billions of pounds. The Cabinet Minister Pat McFadden told us the financial situation was tougher than was revealed before the election. The Tories say Ms Reeves is laying the ground for tax rises. A meeting of Israel's Security Cabinet has ended with authorization for the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to decide how and when to respond to a rocket attack that killed 12 young people in the occupied Golan Heights. The Lebanese armed group Hezbollah has denied it was behind the strike. Venezuela's election authority says the president Nicolás Maduro has won a third term in office. The opposition immediately denounced the official results of yesterday's poll as a fraud. Kemi Badenoch has become the sixth candidate to enter the Conservative leadership race. The former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has said she will not be standing.
Tom, thank you very much. A ballot has been taking place as part of a dispute about the new contract for GP services in England. Voting ends today, and the Doctors' Union, the British Medical Association, has warned that if GPs in England vote to take industrial action, it could bring the NHS to a standstill. Let's hear first from Dave West, who's the deputy editor of the Health Service Journal. How do you think this is going to go, Dave?
Good morning. So it is extremely unpredictable because this hasn't happened before, and because GPs are independent contractors. They're not a normal kind of staff who will withdraw their labour. Each individual practice has to decide whether they will take action and what kind of action they will take. And is also, of course, the pay review settlements are expected imminently, which you would think would feed into a decision about from the BMA's GP leaders about what they're going to do, what the government offers from that pay settlement. But that said, although it's unpredictable, if they do go ahead with action, the GPs are extremely important to the kind of everyday, every hour operation of the NHS, and so there are serious concerns that it will be a very harmful impact. One senior NHS leader just described it to me the other day as potentially insidious, in that it is quite subtle and potentially slow burning, but also potentially very harmful.
What's your assessment of the way the GP contract works in England?
It's a big question, but GP partners who essentially own a stake in their GP practice are funded, receive a sum of income each year, and that the main point of this dispute is over the uplift to that income to their practice, which this year they've been offered so far only 1.9%, where clearly many of their costs are running a lot above that 1.9%, and they've seen real terms reductions in that in recent years.
Just a quick point. Is the funding per registered patient, and then is there also does it also depend on what they do for each patient?
Correct. That is the baseline. The formula is dependent on per patient, measured through estimates of how much need, how ill each patient is likely to be, plus some adjustments for the services they provide. Then it's in the gift of the partners as the managers of that practice to decide what they spend of that on staff, what they spend of that on their premises, what they spend of that on other equipment, and so on. So it's a little bit different from being an employed nurse, who, when your pay uplift is directly about your pay, this is about the income of the company essentially providing the services. But the income is determined, as you say, primarily by the number of patients.
Okay, Dave, thank you very much. Let's turn to Dr. Jess Harvey, who's a GP in Shropshire. Jess, have you taken part in this ballot? And if so, can you tell us how you'd vote, or how you have voted?
Yeah, I have voted, and yeah, I did vote in favour of taking action and rejecting the contract that we've been offered. I think it's really important to just acknowledge that in terms of the activity across the NHS is that about 90% of that's actually happening in general practice, and we're doing that for about 7% of the NHS budget. So we're actually incredible value for money, and whilst I accept that there will be people who are listening to this who have issues with accessing their GP and may not find that our services are always completely what they'd like, is that we're actually working at capacity. We're working as hard as we possibly can, and there's a recent study that surveyed lots of GPs and found that 22% of them said that they were unlikely to be carrying on in general practice in 3 years' time because people are burnt out because they're working so hard to try and keep things going with the budget that we have. So effectively cutting that budget is not going to help anything.
Right, but if it increases, but if the uplift is by more than is currently being promised, there are a lot of variables, aren't there, as Dave was telling us, because individual practices will make decisions about how they spend money. So some patients might want more receptionists, but that's not where the practice partners choose to spend extra money.
You're right in that the partners sort of choose where the money gets spent, but most partnerships, I have no doubt, will direct that money where the patients need it or want it. You know, we do regular friends and family surveys that look at the satisfaction levels, any issues that we have. Certainly in my practice, if there is a huge call out for more receptionists, then by all means that would be where we'd be investing. You know, something like a receptionist, yeah, I'd love to have more receptionists, but no one wants to do the job because they get so much abuse, and I don't blame them. I think it's one of the hardest jobs in the NHS that gets no recognition. But you're right. However, ultimately the money that we get for things like what you're probably referring to as QOF, which is the Quality Outcomes Framework work, which is meeting certain targets for people with certain conditions. Essentially, practices are already doing as much as that as they possibly can anyway. So that isn't somewhere we have wiggle room to try and increase our income with. So this is where the only place that we can get it. Our staff deserve and got pay uplifts last year for the cost of living crisis. I have no qualms about that, and I'm very glad that we did that. However, that isn't reflected in terms of the income that we then got. Our electricity bills have gone up just like everybody else's have. We run a dispensary, which means it has to be air conditioned because of the drugs and keeping those safe. So if you imagine those bills and how those are increasing for all those surgeries, we're getting no income for that. And if people want their general practice surgery to continue or even improve in terms of the services, then we need more money because we can't just run it on fresh air.
Dr. Jess Harvey, thank you very much.
It is 18 minutes to 9. Rupert Murdoch, the owner ultimately of the media empire that includes the Times, the Sun, the Wall Street Journal, and of course Fox News, is reported to be trying to shore up the empire for the longer term by putting his son Lachlan in sole charge. That's what the New York Times is reporting this week in leaks that seem to be designed to put a spanner in the works. Claire Atkinson is a media journalist currently writing a biography of 93-year-old Rupert Murdoch. She began by telling me what the existing plan is for succession.
The structure is that there are 6 children and 4 of them have votes, and 2 of them, who are Wendy Deng's children, only have a financial interest in the trust, whereas the others have some kind of vote in terms of who runs the company and how things proceed. And this is what is the heart of the problem at the moment, is that what we're learning from the New York Times reporting last week is that 3 of the kids are united against Lachlan Murdoch, who is the current CEO of Fox. Now, Fox is the holding company for Fox News. Lachlan also is chairman of News Corporation, which is the part that has all the newspapers. And so 3 of his siblings, Prudence, Elizabeth, and James, there's a fear, their father's fear is that they're going to interfere with his running of the company, Lachlan's running of the company, and he wants to preempt that so that after he passes away, Lachlan is able to maintain control.
Right, and I think the assumption has been that he couldn't do that, that actually this trust is so fixed that there's nothing he could do.
Exactly, and we didn't know until now what kind of page those other 3 kids were on. Now we know from the reporting that they're united. In how this
mutual benefit of all 6 of the children. And if we have a big fight over what the company is going to look like after I pass away, then that will affect the finances of the company and therefore the finances of all of these children. And the judge in the court case has said, okay, I allow that. So they're going to move on to this court case in September, which will rule on whether, Rupert's good for all legal argument can stand.
Ultimately, though, it is a bit like Succession, isn't it? It's almost a cliche to say so, that these are personal relationships, human relationships.
They are in Succession, which is the very popular HBO show. This appears to be, a life imitating art, and this story seems to be more and more about their life and their interactions and the play for power and that never-ending struggle to be in a position where you're getting your way. And it's not just about money, it's also about power.
Claire Atkinson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The time is just after 8:45. Hearings begin today into the Omagh bombing, almost 26 years since the day of the worst single atrocity of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The inquiry has been long awaited by those whose lives were changed forever by the Real IRA's action on the 15th of August 1998, including Michael Gallagher, whose son Aidan, then aged 21, was killed alongside 28 others and 2 unborn babies. Good morning, Mr. Gallagher.
Hello, good morning, Michelle.
Tell us about Aidan and that day, first of all. What was he doing in Omagh that day?
Aidan, well, we live in Omagh, we still live in Omagh, and Aidan on that day was going in with his friend to buy a pair of jeans. He was going out that evening for a date, and he just wanted a pair of jeans, and they went into town, and unfortunately, along with 30 other people, Aidan died, and that really began a nightmare for all of us.
Did you hear the explosion?
I did, yes, I heard the explosion, yeah.
And you must have feared that it was somewhere near Aidan.
Well, I never thought for 1 minute that people would plant a bomb in the middle of a town where there was women and children and young people hanging out on a really beautiful sunny Saturday afternoon. There was many targets they could have put the bomb, but they chose to put it right in the middle of the town. So which means that they basically declared war on the people of Omagh.
Gee, I know you were absolutely at the forefront of the campaign to get this inquiry. It was a very, very difficult path. You ended up with a legal challenge to the High Court, and the judge essentially told the state to act. Did you feel under pressure till you got to that moment to accept that there was a peace process and you needed to let this go, or to let the chances of a process like this go?
Well, we had the peace process in April, 4 months before the Omagh bomb, and as a family, I have 2 girls, and Aidan was our only son, and my wife. All of us went to the polling station and voted for peace, and that's what we hoped we were getting. When we looked into the issues around Omagh, we discovered that this was the largest security and intelligence failure in the history of the state, and actually a lot of the bombings that had happened before that, and at this point Northern Ireland was probably the world capital of car bombs. There didn't seem to be a lot of preparation. It seemed to be that was terrible and it could never happen again, but a couple of years later it did happen. So we just felt that the facts need to be examined. We need to find out. I'm sure there was things done well, but there was also things done not so well, and they need to be learned so that if in the future we have another atrocity or accident, and hopefully that will not be a bomb, it could be a plane or a train or a chemical spill, but we will be in better shape to deal with that. There'll be hopefully a better outcome.
What about those who planted the bomb? No one's ever been convicted, have they? Although there was a finding in a civil case. Is it your hope that even all of these years on, that this process that begins today might lead to justice in a criminal court?
There's a number of us who have pursued this over the past 26 years. I was the lead in the civil action you've just mentioned. We took a case against 5 named individuals and we got a judgment against 4 of those. The people that planted this bomb were lifelong militant Republican terrorists, and that can never be taken away. But the other side of the coin is that we have the best intelligence service in the world. We have a very professional police service, and we just cannot understand how, that it got to the state where 31 people died and over 250 were injured. Of course, we hope that there will be answers come out of this, and it will shed some light on why those bombers were so successful. They planned and prepared and delivered this bomb from the Republic of Ireland, and they returned there, spending less than 40 minutes in Northern Ireland. So there is this was a cross-border crime, and a huge element of this inquiry will encompass the government of Ireland.
Michael Gallagher, thank you very much for talking to us as the public inquiry begins today. Thank you.
The time is 9 minutes to 9. Simone Biles has made her triumphant return to the Olympics in Paris. She turned in superb displays in the artistic gymnastics qualification events over the weekend. She topped the leaderboards. Again, a dazzling display from a woman who is one of the greatest athletes in Olympic history, but who in Tokyo 2020 was derailed by a bout of the twisties, a mental block that impacts the spatial awareness of gymnasts. So she talked in a Netflix documentary, Simone Biles Rising, about that moment in Tokyo.
To me, it felt silent, almost like death. And if I could have ran out of that stadium, I would have. But I was like, keep it cool, calm, collected, don't freak anybody out. Let's go over and be like, we're done here.
Let's talk to Louise Smith, MBE, the Olympian and gymnast who's on the line. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
I mean, she withdrew from events, didn't she? Not just from events in the Olympics. She's had quite a hiatus since then. It is extraordinary to see her back.
It is. And, she's not just back, but she's back with a bang. I mean, she was incredible in her qualifying in Paris just the other day. But yeah, it's gymnastics is no joke. Certainly at the level that Simone does, she's defying the odds of what's possible in women's gymnastics, and she's doing really dangerous stuff. And if your head's not quite in the right space, and you've got an issue, you really do need to take that seriously, because injuries can happen.
Do we know what it is she did to take it seriously and to overcome it?
I mean, what Simone suffered with is quite common in the gymnastics world, and really the only thing you can do is strip it all the way back down to basics. So you kind of get rid of all the difficult skills, and you start with the basics, doing cartwheels again, then round off and basic backflips, and just kind of retrain the mind and body to get it back where it used to be. Because sometimes the urge to twist is a psychological thing, but your body is trying to do something different, and when the two are not in sync, that's when you start to get lost and lose your spatial awareness.
And it would have been easy for her, in a sense, wouldn't it, to say, well, that's it, I can't do it anymore, I'll do something else. I mean, she was very celebrated. She didn't need to do this, or perhaps she did need to do this for herself.
Well, yeah, I think there's two sides to the coin, isn't there? I mean, if she hadn't have stopped and retired at that point, she still has an incredible legacy in the sport at that stage. But being the competitor and the strong-willed person that Simone is, she said, no, I'm not done. It is possible to go on in the sport a little bit longer, in this day and age. And she wants to right those wrongs that she kind of felt that she did in Tokyo. So, she's out here in Paris, and she just looks absolutely incredible.
She does, doesn't she? Do you think she can go all the way? Do you think this can be the complete triumph that she will?
I think so, yeah. I mean, right now she's just topping up an already impossible to reach legacy. She's already one of a kind, and the fact that she's qualified 2 marks ahead of everyone in the all around, and she's made apparatus finals, and I think she's just going to keep banking all those Olympic medals. And she had a bit of a limp yesterday. She's nursing a bit of a calf injury, but I think if she can keep keep pushing and get through that pain and it's manageable, then we should see even more records being broken.
Lewis Smith, thank you very much for talking to us.
It is 5 to 9. A Cambridge research scientist has begun a campaign to encourage us to eat more broad beans. The reason is the chemical composition of them. Her name is Nadia Mohammed Radsman, and she is a plant biologist and researcher at Cambridge University Sainsbury Laboratory. Nadia, how did you get interested and start researching this particular vegetable?
Right. So my background is in biology, and so anything that has to do with lentils, chickpeas, any bean family. And I knew that fava beans or broad beans has high L-DOPA, which is the precursor to the chemical dopamine, which is the happy molecule of the brain. And it's only when I started to discuss with the founder of the William Templeton Foundation of Young People Mental Health that I decided that, well, maybe there is a way for us to actually reutilize this particular bean as a functional food to improve mental health and to reduce depression in young people.
And have you proven that that is the case? That if you're that essentially dopamine is still there even in a cooked broad bean?
Yes, so there have been a couple of different studies where broad beans has been administered to patients that suffer from Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, and dopamine level did increase, well, L-DOPA level did increase in their blood, but we haven't really tested it, and we are in the process of doing clinical studies to actually prove this, that if we could do that to have the L-DOPA very stable in the blood, that can reduce depression, specifically the symptom anhedonia, which is the inability to experience joy or pleasure.
You'd want to know also how much they, people were having, like, do you have to have them at 3 meals a day to get your, dopamine at that level?
Yes, that is exactly what, as a plant biologist, I'm trying to improve the bean to have a higher L-DOPA so that it could be only consumed by just a handful instead of a huge bowl every day.
Well, on that subject, Nadia, stay with us. We've got Amelia Christie Miller with us, who's the founder and chief executive of the Bold Beans Company, which you sell all kinds of beans in jars, but you're here, Amelia, to tell us about how to cook broad beans. Now, I love broad beans. I've got no problem with eating them, but to anyone who feels they're not so keen on eating them, what's the way to go?
Yes, so I am more kind of big on the whole bean family, and I think what's amazing about beans is they're so versatile, and you can cook them in so many ways. But because we haven't kind of retained them as a big part of our food culture, a lot of people get a bit nervous about cooking. What do I do with them? So a big thing that we try and push is this idea of actually take your favorite pasta dish and have it with beans instead.
So broad beans in this case, you might, you certainly need to cook them, right? Some people then say you have to so take them out of the big long pod. Some people then say that you need to double pod them, which is really, which is incredibly fiddly and probably something that puts people off. Do you have to double pod?
Well, you can get frozen broad beans, which is brilliant, and then the dried form of broad beans is fava beans. So there's lots of ways you can kind of have the beans, and actually, you don't have to buy them fresh, you can have them frozen. It's so easy to buy. And, dried forms of beans come cooked in the can section. There's so many different types you can buy.
Yeah, so essentially cook them lightly and put them in a pasta sauce or with rice or...
Yes, so we even talk about the idea of a beanotto, where actually instead of using rice, you use beans, but actually you lean into the kind of risotto combinations such as mushroom or whatever your favourite risotto is, and that's a really great way of kind of...
Wait, so you're using the broad beans instead of the rice?
So actually, we use kind of white beans in that case, but actually I think broad beans would work really well with fresher combination.
Nadia, briefly, what's your favourite way to have them?
Well, just stir fry it. That's the easiest way.
Keep it simple. I'm assuming in your case just a large quantity, until your research proves otherwise. Nadia Mohammed Radsman, Amelia Christie Miller, thank you both.
That's it, Tom Fielden and Tom Smithard, editors, studio directors, Matt Cadden from Michelle and from me.
BBC News at 9 o'clock.
The Chancellor Rachel Reeves is expected to announce billions of pounds in cuts to infrastructure projects to plug a hole in the public finances. It's thought the measures will include the cancellation of some road and rail projects. Ms Reeves is also expected to say that some public sector workers will be given above-inflation pay rises. The senior cabinet minister, Pat McFadden, told Today that the cuts to some projects wouldn't have a negative effect on economic growth.
The foundation for growth is stable public finances, and although we knew we were going to inherit a tough situation, we have found things tougher than was revealed before the election, and that's why we talk about fixing the foundations. That's why we have to be candid about the situation that we have inherited.
The Conservatives claim Labour saw all the figures before the election, and they say Ms Reeves' comments will be a pretext for tax rises later in the year. The Doctors' Union, the British Medical Association, has warned that if GPs in England vote to take industrial action, it could bring the NHS to a standstill. A ballot has been taking place as part of a dispute about the new contract for GP services. Voting ends today. Venezuela's election authority says President Nicolás Maduro has won a third term in office, but the opposition has immediately denounced the official results as a fraud. Unpaid carers are calling for changes to the allowance they can claim because some people are being ordered to repay thousands of pounds. Currently, carers have to pay back the allowance if they earn just a penny above the threshold of £151 a week. The charity Carers UK says the system is causing financial hardship. The government says it will set out a plan to put things right. The divers Tom Daley and Noah Williams will be competing in the 10-metre synchronised platform this morning as Team GB try to add to their tally of 4 Olympic medals in Paris. BBC News.
And many an Olympian will have learnt from past weakness in order to improve future performance. And later this week continues his series on a fresh approach to learning.
Knowledge has transformed our understanding of the universe and ourselves, but I'm here to argue that ignorance is just as important.
Every new creative endeavour basically begins in ignorance.
A new series exploring the power of ignorance, from art to science to politics.
Just to have in the back of your mind that whatever I believe may in fact be wrong, because that opens me up then to being receptive to other viewpoints, to be more careful about what I act on.
The long history of ignorance from Confucius to QAnon, with me, Rory Stewart, continues on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds on Thursday mornings at 9:30.
She's a predator, an archer, and isn't averse to the odd human sacrifice. Not Natalie Haynes, but rather the goddess that she'll be standing up for in half an hour. Artemis will be her focus at 9:30. But first on Radio 4, as part of our summer celebration of the two great 20th century writers, Franz Kafka and George Orwell, here's another chance to hear Ian Hislop and Helen Lewis's debate, their sustaining influence. This episode of Orwell versus Kafka is called Uneasy Dreams and starts with a very special visit to a library.
So this is it. I've seen this manuscript before, but I've not actually been allowed to handle it myself. So inside this cardboard folder, inside another layer of cream paper, there's a brown cloth-bound notebook, and on the first page, we've got the beginning of Kafka's iconic story, The Metamorphosis.
That's Professor Caroline Duttlinger of Wharton College, who's been our Kafka guide in this series so far, here in Oxford's Bodleian Library, admiring the original manuscript of what is arguably Franz Kafka's most famous work.
Als Gregor Samsa eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen erwachte, fand sich in seinem Bett zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer verwandelt.
As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect.
You do have to worry about Kafka, don't you? I know we're familiar with it, but it is the most disgusting image. It says insect in that translation. I mean, it said cockroach in mine.
Yes, monstrous vermin gets used a lot. Lots of ideas of kind of dirtiness kind of come out, or kind of filth or horror. I mean, if you got transformed into like a puffin or something, it might be quite pleasant, but there's certainly a sense that something horrible has happened here.
This is a cockroach, and it scuttles about then it eats things and dissolves things. I think we forget just how gross the whole idea is. And when he's changed into a giant cockroach, his first thought is, oh, I'm going to be late for work, and that bloke I don't really get on with is going to make my life difficult. You're thinking, why are you worrying about this?
Bigger fish to fry.
You're a cockroach.
Well, it's not just Kafka we're worried about today. Orwell's 1984 seems designed to provoke a deep sense of anxiety in its readers. And from the start, we are plunged into a dystopian world of surveillance.
Welcome back to Orwell versus Kafka, a series about two writers who were so influential that they became adjectives. 100 years after Kafka's death, and more than 75 years after the publication of 1984, we're offering an appreciation of the way in which George Orwell and Franz Kafka have provided a map, a shorthand, and a warning for the century in which we now find ourselves.
In this episode, we're talking about anxiety, alienation, isolation, and asking why the disturbing worlds these writers created still resonate with readers today. And to do that, we're joined by another eminent Kafka scholar, Dr. Carolina Wątroba of All Souls College, Oxford, and the George Orwell expert, Dr. Nathan Waddell of the University of Birmingham.
So let's start with Kafka. Carolina Wątroba, can you tell us a bit about Kafka, the writer? Remind us when, where he began writing, and what we know him best for.
Yes, so he starts writing just around the turn of the 20th century. He's around 20 at that time, and he starts jotting down mostly short fragments, often interspersed with his diary entries, and slowly, gradually, he starts building it up, and by 1910, he's sort of already producing longer pieces. In 1912, he writes, for the first time, a sizable story that he's really happy with, and this first story that he writes is The Judgment, and he's doing all of this in Prague, at the time still a big European city, but at the same time really in the provinces of the huge Austro-Hungarian Empire.
And he's got a job, so he's writing at night, is that right?
Yes, so he has a day job, he's a lawyer. This is a state institution, so he's a civil servant in a way, and the biggest advantage of that for him is that his job actually ends between 2 and 3 p.m. So he can then leave work, and you'd think if he really wants to be a writer, he could just go back home and sit at his desk and start writing, but he never does that. He will go for a walk, have a couple of friends, take a nap, have some food, and then what he really loves is writing through the night.
This sounds like journalism in the good old days, except maybe then you'd have like a 3-hour lunch. But I think, Ian, one of the things that makes me think is that he's an interesting writer. He does in some ways remind me of one of those newspaper columnists that constantly writes about how terribly their life's falling apart, but they always actually file the copy on deadline.
Yes, and I'm interested that he waits tonight to write, so that he is therefore almost in a nightmarish state by the time he gets going. Do you think that's all deliberate?
Yes, there seems to be something deliberate about it, that sort of half-tortured state that he needed to really get going. And that story I mentioned, The Judgment, the first one that he really feels like, oh, now I'm a writer, it takes him the whole night, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then he's just so elated that he immediately writes a postscript and says, this is how you should write. That's what writing is. So it seems that he has this sort of organic size that works for him, which is the amount of writing you can do in one go between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning.
And Nathan Waddell, when I think of Orwell, I think that is a man who can bang out some copy before lunch. Was he anxious about the way he was writing?
Well, he was a very copious writer and came to that through a great deal of practice. I mean, the 30s, in some ways, the 1930s, was his apprenticeship as a writer before you get to the more famous works of the 40s, around 1984. It's a huge quantity of material. I mean, the complete Orwell is 20 or so volumes. And this is all of the journal articles, all of the reviews, all the short pieces. And he's just on a roll the whole time. There seems to be very little, if any, delay between seeing the thing or experiencing the thing, sitting down to write it, and a lot of the time it'll do. It's very serviceable, and then you get these high points along the way. Every 100 or so items, you get things that have lasted a century.
So you're saying that neither of these writers seem terribly anxious about the process of writing, and yet they make us unbelievably anxious. Why is that? Why do we turn to them when we're feeling uncertain of ourselves?
I think the main reason with Orwell is that you can kind of occupy the space he occupies, which is of someone mastering a subject as he writes about it. And that's a privileged space to be in, because you're being taken along with him. It's kind of when you watch somebody who is an expert, cook or play the piano, you sort of you feel their excellence and their expertise in the watching of it. They stop, and then you realise how inadequate you are by comparison, and Orwell's much the same. So the anxiety is there. It generates his writing about anxious things. Coming Up for Air, the novel he writes in 1939, is a novel of dread about an imminent bombing attack most of the time. But the actual process of writing is very fluid.
So for Kafka, I think we have to agree that he is an anxious writer. He does hate most of what he writes. He was very unhappy with a lot of his writing, and often he would just abandon things. But I think he's incredibly good at furnishing us with really powerful images that seem to really speak to people across time and across different cultures. And of course, the horrible insect is the case in point. You don't need to have any pre-existing cultural knowledge, I think, to have this image of a giant insect and get sort of...
That would be bad.
Exactly.
Bad. Things have gone wrong, yeah.
Exactly, and for him this anxiety is not some sort of abstract emotional state, it's always like a bodily affliction. So it's either that torture machine carving your sentence into your body, or with Gregor Zamza, the monstrous insect, when he wakes up, yes, he thinks, oh, I will be late for work, but then he also starts thinking, how do I move this body? And this description of this sort of unwieldy body that he doesn't know how to move, and that sense of estrangement from your own body, and not understanding how to function in the world, but being very aware of all of these obligations that you have to fulfill. I think that's the embodied anxiety, I think, that people really connect with.
That's a perfect moment for me to bring in psychotherapy. I was so anxious about Kafka's anxiety that I had to seek professional advice, and I turned to the Professor of Clinical and Family Psychology, Wolfgang Handel-Kuitler, who's a marriage and family therapist based in Hamburg, and he's the author of Kafka's Kinder.
Wolfgang, without being overly critical, you could say that Kafka was neurotic.
I think from the perspective of modern psychology, Kafka would certainly be described as neurotic. I think Kafka was full of fears concerning his father. His father was a very narcissistic person. I'll give you just one example. In his letter to his father, he describes the situation in his early childhood. One night, the child Franz whined for water, was thirsty, and could no longer sleep. First, his father tried to threaten him. Then he took him out of bed, carried him to the balcony, and left him standing there alone in the middle